In the spring of 1934, in the desolate farmlands outside Hays, Kansas, a man named Samuel Pritchard began writing letters to himself. Not reminders or journal entries, but actual letters, sealed in envelopes, addressed in his own handwriting, left on his kitchen table each morning as if delivered by some invisible postman. The letters contained instructions, simple ones at first. Check the well at midnight. Count the crows in the western field. Do not speak to your wife until the rooster crows 3 times. Samuel followed every instruction without question, without hesitation, as though his life depended on obedience to words he himself had written but could not remember writing. Before we dive deeper into this unsettling case, tell me where you're listening from and the exact time there right now. I want to know who's brave enough to follow this story into the dark. What could compel a man to take orders from himself, or from something pretending to be himself? What happens when the voice inside your head stops being yours? The Dust Bowl had already turned Kansas into a graveyard of dreams by 1934. The soil had turned to powder, the sky to rust, and the people to ghosts of what they once were. Samuel Pritchard was 42 years old, a third-generation wheat farmer who had watched his fields die season after season, his savings evaporate, his neighbors abandon their land and flee east. He stayed. His wife Margaret stayed with him. Their 2 children, Daniel age 9 and Ruth age 6, knew no other life than the one buried in dust. The Pritchards were stubborn, faithful, and by all accounts ordinary. Samuel attended church every Sunday, paid his debts when he could, and rarely drank. He was known in Hays as a quiet man, dependable, perhaps a bit too serious, but decent. No one would have called him strange, not until the letters started. Margaret Pritchard first noticed the envelopes in late March. She found one on the kitchen table, addressed to Samuel in his own slanted handwriting. She thought it was a joke, or perhaps some kind of memory exercise he'd read about in a magazine. When she asked him about it, Samuel looked at her with an expression she would later describe to investigators as empty. He didn't deny writing it. He didn't explain it. He simply picked up the envelope, opened it with care, read the contents in silence, and walked out into the fields. Margaret watched him from the window as he stood motionless in the western pasture, staring at the ground for over an hour. When he returned, he said nothing. That night, she found another letter on the table. The content of those early letters has been preserved, retrieved years later from a wooden box Samuel kept hidden beneath the floorboards of the barn. The first letter read, "Samuel, the soil remembers. You must listen to what it says. Go to the well at midnight and count the stones around the edge. Do not count aloud. If you speak, it will hear you." The handwriting was undeniably his. The same cramped, hurried script he used for farm records and grocery lists. But Samuel had no memory of writing it. When Margaret confronted him a second time, he admitted that much. He could not recall sitting down, taking pen to paper, or sealing the envelope. And yet, he believed the letters were important. He believed they contained truths he needed to follow. This was only the surface of something much darker. If you're finding this story as disturbing as I am, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment below telling me what you think is really happening to Samuel. Because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you understood about the mind. By April, the letters had become daily occurrences. They arrived, or rather appeared, on the kitchen table in the barn, once even tucked inside Samuel's coat pocket, though he swore he had been alone all day. The instructions grew more elaborate. Do not let the children play near the southern fence. Margaret must not enter the root cellar after dark. Bury a lock of your hair beneath the oak tree before dawn. Samuel obeyed each command with ritualistic precision. He began waking at strange hours, wandering the property with a lantern, digging small holes in random locations, filling them back in before sunrise. Margaret begged him to see a doctor, to speak with Reverend Calloway, to explain what was happening to him. Samuel refused. He told her the letters were helping him. He told her something was coming, something he needed to prepare for, though he could not, or would not, say what. The neighbors began to notice. Samuel stopped attending church. He stopped going into town for supplies. When his neighbor, a man named Thomas Garrett, came by to check on the family, Samuel met him at the property line and told him, calmly and without emotion, that Thomas should not return. "It's not safe for you here," Samuel said. "The voices don't know you. They might mistake you for something else." Thomas later told the sheriff that Samuel's eyes looked wrong. not wild or crazed, but absent, as though he were looking through Thomas rather than at him. Thomas never returned to the Pritchard farm. Margaret kept a diary during this period, entries that would later become crucial evidence in understanding the psychological unraveling of her husband. In one entry dated April 19, 1934, she wrote, "Samuel does not sleep anymore. I hear him moving through the house at all hours, whispering to himself, though I cannot make out the words. This morning I found him standing in Ruth's room, watching her sleep. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was making sure she was real. He said sometimes he cannot tell the difference anymore. I am afraid. I do not know what to do. I do not know who to tell. If I bring the doctor, Samuel will know I betrayed him. He says the letters have warned him about betrayal." The entries grew more frantic as April turned to May. Margaret described finding strange symbols carved into the wooden beams of the barn, circles within circles, crude drawings of eyes, words written backward in what appeared to be ash or charcoal. Samuel denied creating them. He claimed the symbols had always been there, that Margaret simply hadn't noticed them before. But Margaret knew her own barn. She had grown up on that land. Those symbols were new. The psychological deterioration accelerated. Samuel began speaking about the voices as though they were separate entities, distinct personalities with different intentions. He referred to them by name, though the names made no sense, strings of syllables that sounded more like incantations than proper nouns. "Caleth says the rain will come, but only if we prepare the offering," he told Margaret one evening. Sorum warns that the children must not speak during meals. They are listening through the children's mouths. Margaret asked who they were. Samuel looked at her as though the question were absurd. "The ones beneath," he said. "The ones who were here before us. The ones we buried when we plowed the fields." By mid-May, Samuel had stopped eating regularly. He grew gaunt, his skin taking on a grayish pallor, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were conserving energy for some unseen task. The letters continued to appear, but their tone had shifted. They were no longer instructional. They were confessional. "Samuel, you know what you did. You know what the land demands. You cannot escape the debt. The voices are not punishment, they are mercy. They are giving you a chance to make it right." Margaret found this letter on May 18th and kept it hidden from Samuel, tucking it into her diary. She wrote beneath it, "I believe my husband is losing his mind. I believe he may harm himself. I do not know if he would harm us. I pray he would not, but I no longer recognize the man I married." The children had begun to suffer as well. Daniel became withdrawn, refusing to leave the house unless forced. Ruth developed a stutter and night terrors, waking screaming about the man in the walls who whispered her name. Margaret tried to shield them from their father's unraveling, but the farmhouse was small, and Samuel's presence was suffocating. He spent hours standing perfectly still in the center of rooms, eyes closed, lips moving silently. When asked what he was doing, he would say he was listening for the answer. "What answer?" Margaret demanded. Samuel opened his eyes and smiled, a thin, joyless expression that made her blood run cold. "The one they've been trying to give me all along," he said. On the night of May 22, 1934, Margaret woke to find Samuel's side of the bed empty. She rose and moved through the darkened house, calling his name in a whisper, afraid to wake the children. She found him in the kitchen, seated at the table, an oil lamp burning low beside him. Before him lay a dozen envelopes, all unopened, all addressed to him in his own handwriting. He was staring at them with an expression of profound fear. "They're all the same," he whispered when Margaret approached. I opened one. They're all the same letter. Over and over, the same instruction. Margaret asked what the instruction was. Samuel looked up at her, and for the first time in weeks she saw clarity in his eyes. Terrible, absolute clarity. "It says to go to the cellar," he said. "It says to go tonight. It says to take the family." Margaret Pritchard fled the house that night with her children. She walked 3 miles in the dark to Thomas Garrick's farm and begged for shelter. Thomas agreed and sent his son into Hayes to fetch the sheriff. When Sheriff Howard Dennison arrived at the Pritchard farm the following morning with 2 deputies, they found Samuel in the root cellar, alive but unresponsive, seated on the dirt floor surrounded by over 200 envelopes, all addressed to himself, all opened, all containing variations of the same message. "It is time." The walls of the cellar had been covered in writing. Floor to ceiling, the same phrases repeated thousands of times in Samuel's handwriting. "I hear them. I hear them. I hear them. They will not stop until I listen." Sheriff Dennison attempted to speak with Samuel, but the man seemed unable or unwilling to respond. His eyes were open, his breathing steady, but he did not acknowledge the presence of others. He was transported to the Ellis County Medical Clinic, where Dr. Raymond Holloway examined him and found no physical injuries, no signs of intoxication or poisoning. Samuel's body was intact, but something inside him had shattered beyond repair. Dr. Holloway noted in his report, patient exhibits signs of extreme dissociation and possible auditory hallucinations. He responds to internal stimuli but not to external communication. It is my professional opinion that Mr. Pritchard is experiencing a complete psychological break from reality. Cause unknown, prognosis uncertain. But this was not the end of Samuel Pritchard's story. It was only the beginning of the questions no one could answer. Samuel Pritchard remained at the Ellis County Medical Clinic for 6 days under observation. During that time, he did not speak a single word. He ate when food was placed before him, drank when water was offered, but his movements were mechanical, devoid of conscious intention. Dr. Holloway conducted multiple examinations, searching for neurological damage, testing Samuel's reflexes, his vision, his hearing. Everything appeared normal. Physically, Samuel Pritchard was a healthy 42-year-old man. Mentally, he had gone somewhere no one could reach. On the 3rd day of his confinement, a nurse named Ellen Carmichael reported something disturbing. She had been sitting with Samuel during the night shift when she noticed his lips moving. At first, she thought he was praying, but as she leaned closer, she realized he was whispering the same phrase over and over, so quietly it was almost inaudible. They are not voices. They are memories. They are not voices. They are memories. Ellen documented this in her shift report, noting that Samuel's eyes remained closed the entire time, and his body remained completely still, as though he were asleep. Yet the whispering continued for over 2 hours without pause. Dr. Holloway was intrigued and troubled by this development. He began to theorize that Samuel was not experiencing hallucinations in the traditional sense, but rather some form of severe dissociative disorder, a psychological mechanism by which the mind fractures itself to escape unbearable trauma or stress. But what trauma? Margaret had been interviewed extensively by both the sheriff and the doctor, and she insisted that nothing unusual had happened to Samuel before the letters began. No accidents, no illnesses, no deaths in the family, no financial catastrophe beyond what every farmer in Kansas was already enduring. Samuel had simply woken up one morning and begun receiving instructions from himself, or from something that knew how to mimic him perfectly. The letters themselves became the focus of intense scrutiny. Sheriff Dennison had collected all the envelopes from the Pritchard farmhouse, over 300 in total, found scattered throughout the property. A handwriting analyst from Topeka, a man named Leonard Voss, was brought in to examine them. Voss spent 2 full days comparing the letters against Samuel's known handwriting samples, farm records, tax documents, personal correspondence. His conclusion was unequivocal. Every single letter had been written by Samuel Pritchard. The slant, the pressure, the spacing, the formation of specific letters, all matched perfectly. There was no evidence of forgery, no indication that anyone else had authored the messages. And yet Voss noted something peculiar in his report. While the handwriting is consistent with the subject's known samples, he wrote, there is a noticeable degradation in quality over time. The earliest letters are neat and controlled. The later letters show increasing agitation, heavier pressure, erratic spacing, letters that trail off mid-word as though the writer lost focus or was interrupted. It is my opinion that these letters were written during periods of extreme psychological distress, possibly while the subject was in a fugue state, or otherwise not fully conscious of his actions. This raised a chilling possibility. If Samuel had been writing the letters during fugue states, periods where he was essentially sleepwalking through consciousness, then he was, in a very real sense, communicating with a version of himself he could not remember being. He was receiving instructions from his own subconscious, from a part of his mind that had separated itself and taken on an independent existence. The psychological term for this is dissociative identity disorder, though in 1934, it was not well understood. Dr. Holloway had read about similar cases in psychiatric journals, but he had never encountered one in his rural practice. He wrote to colleagues in Kansas City and Wichita, seeking advice. Most dismissed the case as simple psychosis brought on by environmental stress and malnutrition. One psychiatrist, however, a Dr. Victor Eisenhart responded with a different theory. He suggested that Samuel might be experiencing a phenomenon known as cryptomnesia, a condition where forgotten memories resurface and are perceived as new information, as though coming from an external source. Dr. Eisenhart posited that Samuel might have witnessed or experienced something traumatic years earlier, something his conscious mind had suppressed, and that the voices and letters were his subconscious attempting to force him to confront that buried truth. But what truth? That was the question no one could answer. Margaret was brought back to speak with Dr. Holloway on May 30th. She sat in his office exhausted and hollow-eyed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Dr. Holloway asked her if Samuel had ever mentioned anything from his childhood, any event or experience that might have disturbed him. Margaret thought for a long moment before responding. She told the doctor that Samuel rarely spoke about his early years. His parents had died when he was young, his mother from pneumonia when he was 7, his father from a farming accident when Samuel was 12. He had been raised by an uncle, a man named Josiah Pritchard, who had owned the farm Samuel now worked. Josiah had been a hard man, deeply religious, prone to long silences and sudden outbursts of anger. Samuel had inherited the farm when Josiah died in 1919, and he had never spoken fondly of his upbringing. But Margaret insisted there was nothing specific, no incident that Samuel had ever described as traumatic. He just said his uncle believed the land was cursed, Margaret added quietly. He said Josiah used to walk the fields at night talking to himself, claiming he could hear things beneath the soil. Samuel thought it was just old age and loneliness. He never took it seriously. Dr. Holloway felt a cold prickling at the back of his neck. He asked Margaret if Josiah Pritchard had ever left any writings, any journals or letters. Margaret said she didn't know. Samuel had burned most of Josiah's belongings after the funeral, claiming they were just old superstitions and nonsense. But there might be something left in the attic of the farmhouse. Dr. Holloway immediately contacted Sheriff Dennison and requested permission to search the Pritchard property more thoroughly. The sheriff agreed, and on the morning of June the 1st, a small team returned to the farm. The house was exactly as it had been left, abandoned mid-crisis, dishes still on the table, a child's doll lying in the hallway. The attic was accessed through a narrow hatch in the ceiling of the main bedroom. Inside, they found dust, cobwebs, and a single wooden trunk pushed into the far corner. The trunk was locked, but the hinges were rusted and gave way easily. Inside, they found the remnants of Josiah Pritchard's life, a Bible, some old photographs, a bundle of letters tied with string, and at the very bottom, a leather-bound journal. The journal was filled with Josiah's handwriting, entries dating back to 1902. Sheriff Dennison and Dr. Holloway read through it together in the dim light of the attic, and what they found made them question everything they thought they understood about Samuel Pritchard's condition. Josiah's journal was a record of his own psychological unraveling. He wrote about hearing voices in the fields, voices that called his name, that whispered instructions, that demanded obedience. He described receiving letters he believed were coming from the land itself, though he later admitted he was writing them in his sleep. The entries grew more paranoid and incoherent over time. Josiah wrote about a debt that needed to be paid, about sins committed by the original settlers who had taken the land from the native tribes, about blood that had soaked into the soil and cried out for justice. In one entry dated August 1911, Josiah wrote, "I know now what they want. They want the firstborn. They want the child of the man who plows their graves. I will not give them Samuel. I will offer myself instead. But I do not know if they will accept." There was no further explanation. The journal ended abruptly in September 1911. Josiah lived another 8 years after that final entry, but he never wrote again. Dr. Holloway and Sheriff Dennison exchanged a long, uneasy look. Could Samuel have somehow inherited his uncle's delusion? Was it possible that Samuel had read this journal as a child, absorbed its paranoid logic, and now, under the crushing stress of the Dust Bowl, his mind had resurrected those ideas and transformed them into his own psychological crisis? Or was there something else at work? Something passed down not through genetics but through environment, through years of living on the same cursed land, breathing the same dust, hearing the same silence. Sheriff Dennison made the decision to share the journal with Margaret. She read it in silence, her face growing paler with each page. When she finished, she looked up at the sheriff and said something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Samuel found this journal when he was 13, she said. He told me about it once years ago before we were married. He said his uncle had gone mad at the end, writing crazy things about the farm being alive. Samuel burned the journal. He told me he burned it, but clearly he had not. He had hidden it, buried it in the attic, tried to forget it, and somewhere in the depths of his mind, it had been waiting. On June 3, 1934, Samuel Pritchard spoke for the first time in 12 days. Dr. Holloway was conducting a routine examination when Samuel suddenly sat upright, looked directly at the doctor, and said, "I remembered." His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but the words were clear. Dr. Holloway froze, then carefully asked, "What did you remember, Samuel?" Samuel's eyes were lucid, focused, present in a way they had not been since his breakdown. "I remembered what my uncle did," Samuel said. "I remembered what he made me do." Dr. Holloway urged him to continue. Samuel took a shuddering breath and began to speak. He described an event from the summer of 1911 when he was 12 years old. His uncle Josiah had woken him in the middle of the night and led him out into the fields. Josiah was carrying a shovel. He told Samuel they needed to dig, that something was buried beneath the western pasture, something that needed to be found and moved. Samuel, half asleep and frightened of his uncle's intensity, obeyed. They dug for hours by lantern light until the shovel struck something solid. Josiah uncovered a wooden box, old and rotted, filled with bones, human bones, small and fragile. Josiah had whispered that these were the remains of a child, a native child, buried long before the Pritchards ever owned the land. He said the bones needed to be reburied properly, with prayers and respect, or the land would never stop taking from them. Together they carried the box to the old oak tree at the edge of the property and buried it there, deep beneath the roots. Josiah made Samuel swear never to speak of it, never to tell anyone, and to forget it ever happened. And Samuel had. For over 20 years, the memory had been locked away, inaccessible, until the stress and isolation of the Dust Bowl had cracked open his mind and let it come flooding back. Dr. Holloway listened in stunned silence. He asked Samuel if he believed the bones were real, or if it had been a dream, a childhood hallucination. Samuel shook his head. "It was real," he said. "I know it was real because I can still feel the weight of the box in my hands. I can still smell the dirt, and I think my uncle was right. I think the land has been asking for something ever since. I think that's what the voices were. Not ghosts, not spirits, just guilt, just the weight of something buried that should never have been disturbed." Sheriff Dennison was informed immediately. He organized a team to excavate the area beneath the old oak tree on the Pritchard property. On June 5th, they dug, and 6 feet down, wrapped in the remains of a rotted wooden box, they found bones. Small bones. The bones of a child, no more than 5 or 6 years old, wrapped in fragments of cloth that had long since disintegrated. A local archaeologist confirmed they were human remains, likely dating back at least 70 to 80 years, possibly longer. The remains were turned over to local authorities, and efforts were made to identify them, though records from that period were sparse and unreliable. The bones were eventually given a proper burial in the Hayes Cemetery, with a small marker placed by the county. Samuel Pritchard was not charged with any crime. He had been a child when the bones were moved, acting under his uncle's direction, and there was no evidence of foul play. But the revelation did not bring Samuel peace. If anything, it deepened his despair. He told Dr. Holloway that the voices had not stopped. They had only changed. Now, instead of giving him instructions, they were simply repeating a single phrase, over and over. "You knew. You always knew." Samuel believed that his mind had fractured not because of the bones themselves, but because of his complicity in keeping the secret. He had buried the memory so deeply that it had taken root in his subconscious and grown into something monstrous, something that wore his own face and spoke in his own voice. The letters, the rituals, the paranoia, all of it had been his mind's desperate attempt to force him to remember, to confess, to unearth the truth he had spent his entire adult life trying to forget. Margaret visited Samuel on June 10th, bringing the children with her. Daniel and Ruth clung to her skirt, staring at their father with wide, uncertain eyes. Samuel wept when he saw them. He reached out, and Margaret, after a long hesitation, allowed him to hold her hand. "I'm sorry," Samuel whispered. "I'm so sorry for what I put you through. I didn't know. I didn't understand what was happening to me." Margaret asked if he still heard the voices. Samuel nodded slowly. "But they're quieter now," he said. "Now that I've told the truth, now that the bones are resting, they're quieter. I think maybe they'll stop. In time." but time would prove Samuel wrong. Samuel Pritchard was released from the Ellis County Medical Clinic on June 15, 1934, under the condition that he would continue to receive regular visits from Dr. Holloway and that Margaret would monitor his mental state closely. The family returned to the farm, though Margaret insisted they sleep with the bedroom door locked and that Samuel never be left alone with the children unsupervised. Samuel agreed to these terms without protest. He seemed calmer, more present, though a profound sadness had settled over him like a permanent shadow. He resumed light farm work, though the fields were beyond saving. The Dust Bowl showed no signs of relenting, and the land remained barren and lifeless. Samuel spent much of his time repairing fences, tending to the few chickens they still owned, and sitting beneath the oak tree where the bones had been buried. Margaret watched him from the kitchen window, her heart heavy with a dread she could not name. The letters stopped appearing. For 3 weeks there were no envelopes, no mysterious instructions, no whispered voices in the night. Dr. Holloway visited twice during this period and noted marked improvement in Samuel's condition. "Patient exhibits normal cognitive function," he wrote in his report dated June 28th. "Appetite has returned. Sleep patterns have stabilized. Patient expresses remorse and awareness of his previous psychological state. He acknowledges the trauma of his childhood experience and appears to be processing it in a healthier manner. Prognosis, cautiously optimistic." But Margaret was not optimistic. She told Dr. Holloway in private that Samuel's silence worried her more than his earlier ramblings. "He's too quiet," she said. "It's not the quiet of peace. It's the quiet of someone waiting for something." Dr. Holloway assured her this was a normal part of recovery, that Samuel was likely still processing his trauma, and that silence did not necessarily indicate danger. Margaret wanted to believe him, but she had lived with Samuel for 14 years. She knew the difference between rest and resignation. On the evening of July 4th, 1934, the Pritchard family attended a small Independence Day gathering in Hayes. It was Margaret's idea. She thought getting Samuel out of the house, around other people, might help him feel connected to the community again. Samuel was reluctant but agreed. They spent the afternoon in the town square, where a modest celebration was underway despite the hardships everyone was facing. There was lemonade, a few flags, some tired fiddle music. Daniel and Ruth played with other children, while Samuel and Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd. Thomas Garrick approached them cautiously and extended his hand to Samuel. "Good to see you back on your feet," Thomas said. Samuel shook his hand, but his grip was weak, his expression distant. "Thank you," Samuel said quietly. "I appreciate your kindness." Thomas asked if Samuel planned to stay on the farm, or if he might consider moving given everything that had happened. Samuel looked out toward the horizon, where the dust hung in the air like a veil. "I can't leave," he said. "Not yet. There's something I still need to finish." Margaret's blood went cold. She asked Samuel what he meant, but he did not answer. He simply turned and walked back toward their truck, leaving her standing with Thomas. "What does he need to finish?" Thomas asked. Margaret shook her head, unable to speak. She gathered the children and followed Samuel home in silence. That night, after the children were asleep, Margaret confronted Samuel in the kitchen. "What did you mean today?" she demanded. "What do you still need to finish?" Samuel sat at the table, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes fixed on the wood grain. "I lied to Dr. Holloway," he said finally. "I lied to you." The voices didn't get quieter. They got clearer. Margaret felt her knees weaken. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "What are they telling you?" she whispered. Samuel looked up at her, and she saw in his eyes the same terrible clarity she had seen the night he told her to go to the cellar. "They're telling me the truth," he said. "They're telling me what really happened, what my uncle did, what I helped him do." Margaret's hands began to tremble. "Samuel, the bones were moved. They were buried properly. It's over." Samuel shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "That's not all of it. I remembered something else. Something I couldn't tell Dr. Holloway because I was afraid he'd think I was still insane. But I have to tell someone. I have to tell you." He took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "The child in the box," he said. "It wasn't just bones. When we dug it up that night, my uncle opened the box before we moved it. I saw inside. There was something else. A second skull, smaller. And my uncle, he looked at me and he said, 'This is the cost of the land, Samuel. 2 for the soil, 2 to keep it fed.' And then he closed the box and made me help him carry it. I didn't understand what he meant. I was 12. I thought he was just speaking in riddles the way old people do, but now I understand. I think my uncle didn't just move bones. I think he added to them. Margaret's breath stopped. What are you saying? Samuel's eyes filled with tears. I'm saying I think my uncle killed a child, or 2 children. I don't know when, I don't know why, but I think that's what he was confessing to me that night. I think that's why he went mad, and I think that's why the land won't let me go. Because I helped him hide it, because I kept his secret, because I'm complicit. Margaret stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. No, she said. No, Samuel, you were a child. You didn't know. You can't be responsible for... But Samuel cut her off. I am responsible, he said. I've always been responsible, and the voices aren't punishing me. They're giving me a chance to make it right. They're telling me what I have to do. Margaret's voice rose in panic. What do you have to do, Samuel? What are they telling you to do? Samuel stood and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. They're telling me to dig, he said. They're telling me there's more. That the bones under the oak tree weren't the only ones, that my uncle buried others. And they're telling me where. Margaret felt the room spin. Samuel, please, she begged. Please don't do this. Please don't go back to that place. We can leave. We can take the children and go. We can start over somewhere else. But Samuel shook his head. I can't leave until I know the truth, he said. I can't live not knowing. I have to dig. I have to see. The following morning, July 5th, Margaret woke to find Samuel gone. His side of the bed was cold, as though he had left hours before dawn. She rushed outside and saw him in the western pasture, shovel in hand, digging. She ran to him, shouting his name, but he did not stop. He was methodical, focused, his movements precise. Samuel, stop! Margaret screamed. You're going to hurt yourself! You're going to... But her words died as Samuel's shovel struck something solid. He dropped to his knees and began digging with his hands, pulling back the dirt. And there, just 3 feet down, was another box. Smaller than the first, rotted almost to nothing. And inside, bones. Tiny bones. The bones of an infant. Margaret staggered backward, her hand over her mouth. Samuel lifted the box gently, reverently, and set it on the ground beside the hole. He looked up at her, his face streaked with dirt and tears. There's more, he said. I can feel it. There's more. And he was right. Over the next 3 days, Samuel dug up 4 more boxes scattered across the property. Each one contained the remains of children, ranging in age from infancy to approximately 8 years old. Each one had been buried in shallow graves, hidden beneath decades of soil and silence. Sheriff Dennison was called immediately after the first discovery. By the time the 4th box was unearthed, investigators from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation had arrived. The Pritchard farm was declared a crime scene. Samuel was taken into custody, not as a suspect, but as a witness and for his own protection. Margaret and the children were moved to temporary housing in Hayes, provided by the county. The investigation that followed was extensive and grim. Forensic examination of the remains suggested they had been buried at different times over a span of approximately 15 years, between 1895 and 1910. Records were searched for missing children in the region during that period. 6 children were eventually identified, though 3 remained unidentified. All had been reported missing from surrounding farms and towns, their disappearances attributed to accidents, illness, or simply vanishing into the vast, unforgiving landscape of rural Kansas. No one had ever suspected foul play. No one had ever connected the disappearances. Josiah Pritchard had lived alone on the farm during most of that period. A reclusive, deeply religious man who kept to himself and was rarely seen in town. Investigators found no evidence that Josiah had any direct connection to the missing children, but the location of the graves on his property was undeniable. The conclusion was horrific but inescapable. Josiah Pritchard had been a serial child murderer. But why? That question gnawed at everyone involved in the case. Dr. Holloway was brought in to consult, and he reviewed Josiah's journal extensively. He theorized that Josiah had been suffering from a severe psychotic disorder, likely exacerbated by isolation and religious mania. The references in his journal to debts owed to the land and offerings required suggested Josiah believed he was performing some kind of ritualistic appeasement, sacrificing children to an imagined force he believed controlled the farm's prosperity. It was a delusion, a tragic and monstrous delusion, but one that Josiah had lived and acted upon for over a decade. And Samuel, as a child, had stumbled into the aftermath of that delusion without understanding it. carrying the psychological weight of it for 23 years until it finally shattered him. The media coverage of the case was extensive, but restrained by the standards of the time. The Hayes Daily News ran a front-page story on July 12, 1934, with the headline, "Farm of Horrors. Bodies of children discovered on Ellis County property." The article detailed the investigation, but withheld the most graphic details out of respect for the families of the victims. Nationally, the story was picked up by several papers, though it was often overshadowed by the ongoing economic crisis and the relentless devastation of the Dust Bowl. Still, the case sent shockwaves through rural Kansas. Parents held their children closer. Old suspicions and fears resurfaced. People began to whisper about other unsolved disappearances, other strange neighbors, other secrets buried in the soil. Margaret Pritchard gave only one interview, to a reporter from the Topeka Capital Journal. She spoke quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes red from weeks of sleepless nights. "My husband is not a monster," she said. "He is a victim. He was a child when this happened. He didn't know. He couldn't have known. And he spent his entire life trying to forget, trying to be good, trying to build something clean on cursed ground. What happened to him? What his mind did to him, that was the cost of carrying a secret too terrible to speak. I don't know if he'll ever recover. I don't know if any of us will. But I want people to understand that Samuel is not his uncle. He is not responsible for those children's deaths. He is only responsible for surviving them." Samuel remained in psychiatric care for the remainder of 1934. He was eventually transferred to the Osawatomie State Hospital, a psychiatric facility in eastern Kansas, where he received treatment for severe dissociative disorder and trauma-related psychosis. Dr. Holloway continued to visit him periodically, documenting his progress. In his final report, dated December 1934, Dr. Holloway wrote, "Samuel Pritchard remains haunted by the knowledge of what his uncle did, and by his own unwitting participation in concealing those crimes. The voices he heard were not supernatural, nor were they purely hallucinatory. They were the sound of his own conscience, fragmented and externalized, demanding that he confront a truth too painful to bear consciously. In a sense, Samuel's mind created the letters and the voices as a mechanism of confession, a way to tell himself what he could not allow himself to know. It is a tragic and deeply human response to unbearable psychological burden. Whether Samuel will ever fully integrate this trauma and return to a functional life remains uncertain. But he is, at the very least, no longer alone with his guilt." Margaret filed for divorce in early 1935, not out of anger, but out of necessity. She could not care for the children and maintain a connection to the farm or to Samuel's fractured mental state. She moved with Daniel and Ruth to Topeka, where she found work as a seamstress. The children were young enough that, with time and distance, the memories of their father's breakdown faded into something vague and dreamlike. Daniel grew up to become a teacher. Ruth married young and moved to Colorado. Neither ever returned to Hayes. Neither ever spoke publicly about their father. Samuel Pritchard was released from Osawatomie in 1938, declared stable but permanently changed. He did not return to the farm. The property had been seized by the county for unpaid taxes and eventually sold to a family from Missouri who knew nothing of its history. Samuel moved to a boarding house in Kansas City, where he worked odd jobs and lived quietly, speaking to almost no one. He attended church regularly, sitting alone in the back pew, his lips moving in silent prayer. He died in 1956 at the age of 64, of heart failure. His obituary in the Kansas City Star was 3 lines long and made no mention of the farm, the voices, or the graves. The case of Samuel Pritchard raises questions that extend far beyond the horror of what was uncovered on that farm. It forces us to confront the fragility of the human mind, the way trauma can lie dormant for decades before erupting with catastrophic force. Samuel's descent into psychological horror was not the result of supernatural forces or external manipulation. It was the result of guilt, secrecy, and the impossible weight of complicity in something he could neither understand nor escape. His mind fractured because it had no other way to survive. The letters were his subconscious screaming at him to remember. The voices were his conscience demanding confession. And the tragedy is that even after the truth was revealed, even after the bones were given proper burial, Samuel could not forgive himself. He could not escape the knowledge that he had, however unwittingly, helped hide the deaths of innocent children. This case also exposes the dangers of isolation, both physical and psychological. Josiah Pritchard was able to commit his crimes because he lived on the margins, disconnected from community, consumed by delusions no one was close enough to recognize or interrupt. Samuel inherited not just the land but the isolation, the silence, the crushing weight of unspoken horrors. And in the end, it destroyed him. The farm, the dust, the endless Kansas sky, they all became accomplices in a psychological unraveling that might have been prevented if someone, anyone, had been close enough to see the warning signs before they became catastrophic. Do you think anyone is truly immune to obsession? Can any of us say with certainty that, under the right circumstances, our minds would not fracture the way Samuel's did? The human psyche is more fragile than we like to believe. We are all, in some sense, one buried secret away from hearing voices we cannot silence. If this story has stayed with you the way it has stayed with me, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below telling me what you think truly drove Samuel to the edge. Was it guilt, inherited madness, or something else entirely? And if you want more deep dives into the darkest corners of the human mind, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These stories need to be told. These voices need to be heard, even the ones that whisper from places we'd rather not look.